It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday is partially tied into the workshop that's happening this weekend. Link in the description box if you want to join our healthy conflict workshop. And this topic came up talking to one-on-one clients, Leanna Care's clients, about some conflicts they've been into. So that's the tie-in. And this could have been on Wellness Wednesday as well, but the people who talked about it are all men, and I'm going to take a particular masculine framing on it because one of the issues with this stuff is when you get into really generalized language, meaning goes fly away. So I am not saying that this only happens to men. It's just there's a particular relationship with men and this particular phenomenon of, the validation and gaslighting conundrum. So if you like this content, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK, or buy a ticket to the workshop. Come to the workshop on the weekend. We're going to learn a bunch of cool stuff about effective communication and healthy conflict. Because conflict happens, right? And sometimes you have to challenge people. And the problem with having certain trauma symptoms, like, finding it very hard to handle rejection, is that people end up with this track record of avoidance, because even when people were nice to them, it turned out to just be a manipulation. And the reason I'm putting this on Manly Monday instead of Wellness Wednesday is that there's more of the structures in society for certain things are indirect when it comes to men. I won't say they're not there, but there's this false perception that men are simple and women are complicated. But it's not true in my experience. It's just complicated in different ways. And there's a biochemical element with men sometimes. Bump my mic, made a bad noise. Whoops, sorry about that. In that there's this whole thing about whether men cry less than women, and there is a physiological impact with, certain body chemicals. And one of the things that any release of emotion does is produce oxytocin, which is one of the good brain chemicals that alleviates depression and anxiety and all that stuff. Now, we don't know if it's probably not all biochemicals. Some of it is learned behavior. So that's the stuff we can do something about, right? Because men are really trained to bottle things up. And I say this as somebody who bottled things up. Now, it's not that women don't shut their mouths about a ton of stuff. There's just more of a social outlet. It's not necessarily healthy because it tends to be gossip, or back talk, but at least women are able to talk about what's going on with them. Because men tend to socialize based on shared activities and no one wants to ruin other people's good time. Yes, they have friends. Yes, they have social interaction. Yes, they form bonds, but are they talking about their feelings and what's bothering them and, celebrating successes and all of that important stuff? No. And that matters because we get into this idea of the self and identity and how you relate to the world. And so much of it for men ends up involving their job because it's one of the few places they can get objective feedback, right? I mean, okay, I I anchor myself in a lot of my own experiences in this, and I happen to have far more male friends than women. It's really tough when I have this guy I know who's looking to date, and I don't have anybody to introduce him to because I have so few female friends. um, but I do notice a lot of stuff when it comes to how men react to compliments that is interesting because I'm told I don't take compliments well. And I've tried to work on that. And the issue I've found in introspecting is that the stuff I'm quote unquote complimented on, I don't find terribly important. You know, any comments about my appearance, you know, it's nice if someone finds me, you, whatever pronoun you want to use, attractive, but is it really relevant to information-based videos? You know, hey, if you think I'm cute, it's a nice extra, but the idea that someone would receive information from somebody they find more attractive differently than they find less attractive, that takes it into the realm of not a compliment, because looks don't last. I also do find those sorts of things, I feel put in a box. And this is where I relate to the guys over the last week that have talked to me about, you know, because I'll tell them something I think they're legitimately good at, because I don't BS people. That's a great way to destroy trust between people. But that's exactly what happened. That was the piece I was missing. That, you know, I'd get a funny look when I congratulate them on something, or tell them they were smart, or, you know, kind or considerate or compassionate, or that they had a lot of empathy. And I'd be like, what was that reaction about? And eventually it came out that they associate praise with gaslighting. They associate praise with manipulation. And it is true, one, manipulators do manipulate with praise. A lot of people end up getting an externally set sense of self based on what they were told they were good at, and then stuff that they either got no feedback on or negative feedback on. And obviously that's human, right? That's what people who are children and adolescents do. Their sense of self entirely comes from the approval of adults, of authority figures. In a perfect world, you eventually start to self-define and, you know, decide which elements of yourself matter to you and which elements don't. And, you know, more and more, ideally, it's supposed to be about what you like about yourself, not what the world likes or says it likes about you. Because it's true, you can really get in a trap. I mean, I know that for a long time, very intelligent people have trouble admitting they're wrong, in my experience. I know this was something that I was really self-conscious about when I was a lot younger, because I was, you know, I was fat, I was ugly, I was this, that, and the next thing. I was the exact same clothing size I am now, for the record. It was just the perceptions that people had. It was the 90s and the waif was in. So if you were bigger than a size 6, you were fat back in the day. but I was all that stuff, but I was smart. And so I got this self-image that if I didn't know something, I'd failed, or I'd let everybody down, and I had to unlearn that. And that's an example of how praise created, of a sort, it wasn't always seen as a good thing. It was often seen as an alien thing. But, that was, the opinion of the crowd forming my self concept instead of what I thought about myself forming my self concept. And then you get into the thing of, well, how do I know I'm right? And that is why the gaslighting and validation are not direct antonyms. They're not opposites. They're not the complementary of each other. It's more, there's a third thing. And I don't like the terms that are used for this. Now, part of it is just because things have shifted. The general commentary is that the opposite of gaslighting is not validation, because you can gaslight somebody through validation. The opposite of gaslighting is critical thinking. Now, the problem is that the entire concept of critical thinking has been gaslit, because people are taught that critical thinking is emotionless, and it's not. In order to get the right answer involving anything involving people, you have to factor in emotions. Emotions are a data point. Now, are the emotions sometimes not immediately and directly tied to what's going on? Yes, we're going to talk about that at the workshop. But that doesn't mean the emotions are invalid or that someone is overreacting. And that's where a lot of men get into, right? Somebody who's not the greatest person lures them in with, you're so strong, you're so tough, you're so this, you're so that. And then the minute a guy is vulnerable and has a bad time and expresses anything but anger, but also anger, then the validation shifts to, criticism, man up, that kind of thing. And that stuff is a big reason why I get so irritated over this idea that gender is just a biological state, because so many guys are caught in the trap of masculinity. And we focus so much on the male-female thing and not enough on what it means to be an adult. And it keeps women from really owning responsibility, and it keeps men from being in touch with their emotions, and neither of them are good. You need both. Because I find a lot of guys, and it's really well-meaning, but if I could take one thing in 80% of my client base that would make things much better for them instantly, it would be taking responsibility for your feelings and your reactions and no one else's. Your feelings, your reactions, your behavior, and no one else's. And this is what it splits into a million thought directions. And so I'm going to try to refine, because the most common examples I hear are, you're selfish, and even accusations of abuse can be gaslighting, because not everything that hurts is abuse. There's a difference between something stinging but it being fair and something being a boundary violation. And the connection, if we got gaslighting over here and validation over here, that boundaries, critical thinking, or an accurate assessment of the situation, those are essential because there's ouch but fair, or then there's this is not fair, it's not true, there's too many missing factors here, I do not accept this criticism. And the one I hear a lot is selfish. And here's the issue with accusations of selfishness for me, and this could be its own video. I might do this for Wednesday. Because women and selfishness and accusations of selfishness, this comes from women do this because it's done to them. I'm telling you this, guys, so you know. But you're so selfish. You're being so selfish. Being selfish is better than your selfish overall character trait. Okay, better, but still, is it a really useful comment? What does it matter if someone's being selfish? Sometimes selfish is rational. Is it putting someone else? Is the act violating another person's boundaries because someone is putting too much emphasis on their own wants and needs and no consideration for somebody else's? That, and that can be done via expressions of empathy. Instead of calling someone selfish, it's better to go, here's the impact it had on me. And if someone goes, I don't care, well, then they're being selfish. Here's the thing about, if a person's really selfish, they're not going to care you called them selfish. The only people that insult stings are people who aren't selfish. And that's why it's often used as gaslighting. That's why it's often used as an abuse tactic. And sometimes people aren't aware necessarily of what they're doing because it was used on them. And they just think that's the way people talk. But if you actually stop and think about that, a selfish person doesn't care they're selfish because they're selfish. So why call somebody that? If you actually believe a person is selfish, there's someone you've got to get out of your life, or at least limit contact with. There's no point in having a fight with them. So if, somebody called you selfish, and we all know there's a difference between something stinging because you believe it to be true and something stinging because you feel like you've been completely gotten wrong. And that's one of those things that self-awareness, I prefer self-awareness to critical thinking, but the things are quite merged up in each other. But that's why boundaries are so important. Because when you set boundaries and don't tolerate that sort of language, it actually, this is one of the things we're going to talk about in the workshop, it actually fosters better communication. Because if somebody doesn't have that easy out, that cheat of language, then they have to get down to what's really bothering them. And there's probably something at the core of what's bothering them. You just don't know what it is when somebody's just calling you names, right? Now, what a lot of guys in these situations tend to do is, like I said, that accountability, top responsibility for actions and outcomes without that self-awareness, without that critical thinking, well, then they just take on more and more and more and more and more. And this big guilt dynamic happens in the relationship, because what happens, A lot of men, when they're feeling guilty, they pull away. They're like, I don't deserve this person in my life, so they pull away. Or this hurts. I never developed the skills to handle emotions like this, so I'm just going to pull away so I don't explode. And then the person calling the person selfish calls them selfish again and again and again. And you have a relationship being destroyed that didn't need to. Because if the person making the accusation of selfishness just retracted the clause, man, you don't need them, and just said more specifically what the issue was. You know, it's, I ended up looking stupid in front of my boss because you promised you'd bring that thing and you let me down. That's a lot more specific than you're selfish, right? Or, you know, if somebody is relying on you and you let them down and they're left holding the bag, they're going to be pissed. They have a right to be pissed. I find a lot of the people that do that, it's less that they're selfish and more they're trying to keep everybody happy. They're people pleasers. So that's not really a selfish instinct. You can argue it is, but it's more a survival thing that they've learned. Keep everybody happy and mom won't blow up, you know, or dad won't hit me or whatever. You know, it's learned early in childhood, and as you center, as you become more you learn that you have to say no to certain things so that you're not overextended and you can be reliable. And that's hard because it disappoints people. But it's way better to say, no, I can't commit to this right now, than to do it and then let the person down. And a lot of the times, people who are unreliable or irresponsible, they have the absolute best of intentions. And then there are the people who actually are selfish. But again, if you think someone's selfish, why are you letting them close to you? That's not a survival trait, as a friend of mine would say. And there's a lot of self-gaslighting that happens when people are like, no, I can do this. I can, if I just don't sleep and, you know, I do all this stuff. No, that's not good. That's a sign, again, of a lack of healthy boundaries. And a lot of people don't have healthy boundaries because their environment and the lack of nurturing they suffered never allowed them to form, or at some point shattered them. And gaslighting is a very effective tool to erode boundaries, with the dynamic of men being hyper responsible, underdeveloped in being in touch with their emotions. Because if somebody's out of touch with their emotions, it's really easy to manipulate them into doing things if you make them feel bad enough. Let me give you an example of that. She's like, what? If they're not in touch with their emotions, how does that work? People who are not in touch with emotions feel those emotions still. Emotions are human. Everybody feels them. But if you don't know what they are, if you can't put a name to the sensation, that sensation becomes overwhelming and terrifying. And people will do anything to make it stop. And so when someone is on somebody, and if somebody, especially in, romantic relationships, those are vulnerable places. And so when somebody's called selfish, when, the other issue with someone who doesn't know, if they're not in touch with their emotions, is they don't know how to meet their emotional needs. So you tend to get a person, and a lot of women do not know how to meet their emotional needs too. Like I said, targeted at men here. But when you have two people who don't know how to get their needs met. They don't know how to ask for it. They don't know how to put it into words. Then you get the you're selfish, pull away. You're selfish, pull away. You're selfish, pull away. You're pulling away, you're cold and distant. Well, that last part's true, but it completely neglects the reasons the person is pulling away. And I mean, I avoidance is I get this with guys. Hear me out here, okay? I have this tendency to be accused of being too aggressive. So I know what it's like to be treated as the mean, abusive predator so-and-so, right? And society has taught us that that's bad. Society has taught us that it's not about intents, it's about outcomes. And the problem with that is breeding ground for gaslighting, right? All somebody has to say is you're abusing me and it's true. Nuh-uh. No, not the way it works. Intents do matter. And when a person has been taught that any aggression is abuse, any standing up for yourself is wrong, bad, the only thing they have left to maintain any boundary integrity at all is avoidance. Because the other option is submission. And people just can't do that for very long. And, all of our stuff connected to romantic relationships is fucked up in popular consciousness. But even with that, when your gut's telling you something's wrong and you don't know how to listen to your gut, it all becomes about that accountability. Well, accountability and responsibility is not about just taking on more and more and more and more. It's about taking on the part you actually contributed and no more. And that's a very hard thing for adults to establish in their lives, because in the short term, the reactions of the people around them are brutal. I'll talk about this more on Wednesday. But one of the things I've noticed with people with treatment-resistant depression is that environment surrounding them is a really big thing. Because early steps to stand up for yourself, early steps to assert yourself are awkward. You don't get it right the first time, right? And if you get this horrible reaction, you're very unlikely to do it again, right? And that's what happens to a lot of people when they're trying to be not depressed, is they fumble their early attempts. The people around them freak out because all those relationship patterns have been deeply ingrained, right? And they're like, well, that made me feel worse. I'm not doing that again. I learned that you have to do it again, because the alternative is being depressed, and a person can't be that long term, the point of life just disappears when you're in that state. And it is very tough to develop that sense of, no one around me understands this right now, this thing about me, but I know that it's real, and I know I had good intentions, and yeah, I'm gonna see how I can do it better, but I'm not going to accept that my motivations were wrong, or my motivations were bad, or that my motivations don't matter. And if you're thinking now that, those college groups that you were a part of, You're thinking, well, that suggests it means that all those people that told me that intents don't matter, only outcomes, were abusive. Yeah, it's an abuse dynamic. It's bad theory. It's absolutely bad theory. Now, when you're talking about policy, that's different. If a policy isn't getting the outcomes it was intended to get, it doesn't matter how well-meaning it was. You change the damn policy. That's, consequentialism has a place in public policy. If you're trying to cut poverty rates and something you do increases them, well, that's bad policy. But that's accountability, right? But the best way to get the new policy passed is not to tell your opposition that they hate poor people. It's you say, look, you want to reduce poverty. I want to reduce poverty. This isn't working. Let's follow the data. Let's try something else because we both want the same thing. We just don't agree on how to get there. Much more persuasive, right? So to summarize, yes, it's real if you feel or think that you've been gaslit by validation in the past. It's very real. It does not mean that everybody who pays you a compliment is gaslighting you. I try to pay everybody honest compliments, but especially men, because we're not socially encouraged to compliment men the same way we compliment women. For whatever reason, we think men don't need the feedback the same way. They absolutely do. A person can't know what they're doing right just by telling them what they're doing wrong. They have to know, no, you're good at this. This is right. Because then they can use that as a backbone to build some other things on. Okay, I know I can rely on my instincts here, so let's use those to improve other areas. Now, just because you're good at something doesn't mean you're never wrong in that area. But again, that's where the constant checking in comes in. That's where that, critical thinking, that awareness of self comes in. And that's the opposite of gaslighting, right? That's plugged in. And in order to have that, you need both a belief and a sense of accountability. No excuses for the stuff you actually are responsible for. But then you need to be in touch with your emotions as well, because you're responsible for those. And we're going to get into more of this in the Healthy Conflict Workshop this coming Sunday. Link in the description box below. If you'd like to support these endeavors, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK, or sign up for a Leanna Care session yourself. We'll continue this stuff about kind of an inner compass on Wellness Wednesday. Thanks for watching. Manly Monday.